Fish Habitat Partnership. And the one that's our biggest funding source that we don't have a whole lot of authority over is the Fisheries Management Administrative and Logical Support Cooperative Agreement, which has been, this is our third one of these, right? Yeah. And that's where a lot of funding happens for work that we do, such as NEMAP and the Horseshoe Crab Survey, aquaculture projects, and many other North Atlantic right whale projects, et cetera, et cetera. So the main place that we actually work on the budget is in the fall when we do the action planning, and that's where we divide up what we have in the travel budget for, or the species budget for the Atlantic Coastal Act. So that's what you all made that decision last fall, and that's incorporated in this budget. And the rest of them are set either by the committees such as CMAP and Fish Habitat Partnership. ACCSP, the Coordinating Council, sets that budget. MRIP is really determined based on state needs as well as past their history. Wallop-Bro has been level funded forever, and so that basically covers some staff salaries for rec species coordinators and the habitat coordinator, as well as a small amount of funding for meetings, which is usually allocated to artificial reef. So when we get to today's budget review, the most important page to look at will be page 1, which is the general and administrative budget, which is comprised of the indirect from all of the aforementioned grants, as well as, I use grants and cooperative agreement interchangeably, by the way, so it means the same thing, as well as the base funding. So first of all, are there any questions about that, or did I go too fast?
Questions? We'll see.
Okay, so then I would tell you that we're in great shape. We brought in, or we have $1.6 million in overhead to add to the $733,000 to state assessments, giving us a healthy $2,695,415 for our general and administrative budget. We don't have a mortgage anymore, as you all know. So page 1 outlines how we propose to spend that, those funds. I won't go through line by line unless you want me to. No? Does anyone want me to? Does anyone need me to? Okay.
You will if you want to.
No, I don't want to. There's really nothing to point out. It's a pretty standard average. It's what we've been doing based on history. So I'm not going to go through the rest of the pages unless, again, there's a need to, unless my boss wants me to. So it's up to the will of the committee. Have you all looked at the budget? Okay, great.
Yeah, don't be bashful. If there's any questions,
I
now's the
can
time to ask. All right, Jim.
Can we do it after the striped bass meeting tonight? Would that be?
Fortunately, not my decision. Okay.
I think the lack of query speaks to the trust that everybody places. Oh, Sheree, go ahead.
I can.
We're being broadcast, so you probably need to do
The NEMAP, if and when that comes in, does that come into here, or does that go directly to NOAA, from NOAA?
NEMAP comes directly from NOAA to us. Mhm.
To you guys?
To us, and
Okay.
then we give it to VIMS and to Maine.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Like I said, don't be bashful. If there's anything that's perplexing, now's the time to ask. Go ahead, Bob.
Thanks. Just one sort of update more than anything else on, this group had a number of discussions on hiring an additional stock assessment person, and we had some different ideas bouncing around, and at one point, this group agreed to hire a stock assessment person and place them in Virginia at VMRC, and the idea there was going to, ASMSC would provide funding for this person for a couple years, and VMRC would take that over. And by luck, VMRC actually found the money early. They didn't need that 2 years of funding. So we started talking to the South Atlantic states a little bit more in particular Georgia and South Carolina, because they've got a pretty small stable of stock assessment people. And we're still talking to both those states and with Doug and Mel Bell, trying to figure out what the best location for that person to sit in is. But the idea is, regardless of where the new person sits, they'll work on all South Atlantic species, cobia and red drum and other things that are going to help out sort of everybody below the Chesapeake Bay. Rather, just because that person sits in one office doesn't mean they're only working on whatever blue crabs in Georgia or something like that. There'll be someone that's helping out with all the South Atlantic species, because they need some help down there on those assessments. To be blunt, I'm going to try to keep them out of the cobia business, because hopefully the cobia is handled at the Science Center, and through CDAR process, but we'll see how that goes. I mean, there'll probably be some work to help with the cobia assessment, but there's a number of other things that can use some work. So I just want to let everyone know we're still talking about that. We're making some progress, and I think we'll make a decision soon, very soon. Talking with Doug. I know Doug and Mel have talked a lot. We probably could have sorted it out this week, but unfortunately Mel couldn't make it up here. So just an update to everyone. Happy to answer any questions, but I didn't want anyone to think that we forgot about doing that.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. And just to clear the record, I found out about this week, so it's not patronage from the chair. Just so everybody can, be clear about that. I just found out about it. So, but all right. Any further questions, discussion on the budget? Go ahead, J. Mac.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not on the budget, on the stock assessment scientist. So if we're sort of turning to a focus of those South Atlantic species, and maybe you've had these discussions already, but you probably want to think about somebody with expertise in like data limited assessment techniques. I think that would be a good fit for those types of species. Just a comment. Thank you.
Yep, we certainly have to live in that nightmare, don't we? And so, well, good. All right, no further questions, discussion of the budget. I'd entertain a motion to approve the budget as presented. Got a motion by Dennis and a second by Pat Kelleher. Any further discussion on the motion? Any opposition to the motion? Seeing none, we'll consider the motion approved by consent. Thank y'all. All right, our next item, and I'll preface this before I turn it over to Bob, is we talked about the appeals policy quite a bit over our virtual meetings, and I'd like to, if possible, to clear the deck of this, if possible, at this meeting, so we can move it to the policy board and check the box off for one of our things that's sort of looming. We've got other ones, and those of you that were at Menhaden yesterday heard the cry for having the policy board look into how do we deal with years with flawed data, I guess you could say. So I'd like to get rid of one before we add another one, so if that's at all possible. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bob.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and just so we're all literally on the same page, the document that I'll be working off of is the updated appeals process document dated 5/1/22, and that was the one I sent out actually over the weekend. So there's a couple versions bouncing around. They're not that different, and if you're looking at an older version, that's all right. We'll work through it. May 4th. That may have been when you print. Did you print it today, or is it? Huh. I didn't work on it this morning, I don't think.
That's the one that was attached to the agenda.
Oh, that says for review on May 4th?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so, okay, it's the one that says for consideration by the executive committee on May 4th. Doug, is that what you're reading? So the line above that, it should have a date of 5/1/22. If not, it's a little bit earlier version, and that's okay. We'll work through that. But as Spud mentioned, we've talked about this as a group a number of times. There's There are a few revisions that were suggested and changes to the process that were suggested after our experience with black sea bass appeal from New York. And, the idea is sort of, the appeals process luckily isn't used all that much. So when we did use it and went all the way through the process with New York, which was the first time we've ever done that, there were some areas that the executive committee and other commissioners felt could be improved. So this document reflects some of those potential improvements. Skipping forward to page 4, this is really the substance of what we need to talk about. Let me skip forward. If you go down to the sort of the lower half of page 4, there's a series of options that describe what would happen if the management, if there's an appeal, the policy board says, yes, this is a valid appeal. The species management board needs to take action. The list of 3 options there in the lower part of page 4 list what the options that are available to that management board if that management board can't come to a resolution on what the policy board has requested for them. So the board can request clarification. The management board can say, hey, we're not able to figure this out. We need some clarification from the policy board, and the policy board provides more guidance to the management board is option 1 there. Option 2 is the management board can inform the policy board. They just can't do it. They're stuck. They're not able to respond to what the policy board said, and then the policy board will resolve the issue. And then the third option there is that the management board can request additional analysis from technical groups. So, if they need to better understand what would happen if certain provisions were implemented, they can choose that option. So, in previous discussions, this group agreed all 3 of those are viable options and reasonable if a management board cannot come to some sort of resolution on what they've been charged with by the policy board. So I don't think there's, or we can, but I don't think there's a lot of time or need to spend a lot of time on that. This group's already agreed. All 3 of those are reasonable courses of action if the management board can't figure out what to do based on the guidance they have from the policy board. So I think that part's relatively set. The contentious point or the point of continued discussion is above that toward the top of page 4. And this is the idea of what's the range of options, what's the latitude that the species management board has when they're trying to make a decision. And the management board can only select, like option 1 says, be limited to the management options as written in the draft amendment. So very strictly, you have to pick exactly what's in a draft amendment. There's no latitude for movement at all. If the draft document says a 16-inch size limit, 18-inch size limit, or 20-inch size limit, that's what you pick. You pick one of those discrete numbers, and that's all the latitude that the board has. If you go down to option 2, it's kind of the idea within the range of options that are brought forward in the document. So back to my example, 16, 18, 20, 17 inches is viable. It's within the range. The management board could select that. And then John Clark shared a document with me, put some thought into this, which is great. And I shared his document and thoughts with the group. And then based on his, I kind of boiled it down or paraphrased it, and I hope I didn't offend you, John, in what I wrote. And it's sort of what I wrote here, and I'll go ahead and read it. If the policy board requires a management board to take action, specific correction action, the scope of potential corrective actions must be consistent with the presentation of management options provided in the public draft amendment or addendum. And the idea there is, as we go through future amendments or addendum, we have an obligation up front to say, all right, here's exactly the latitude that the board has when they're approving this amendment or addendum moving forward. You can work within the range, you can hybridize options, you can do whatever, that latitude has to be spelled out in a draft document and presented to the public. And then should there be an appeal and the policy board sends something back to that species board is working within the same sort of confines of what's defined in the original draft document. So, this is like a 2-step process. Now, if option 3 was selected, it obligates all of us to now include a very detailed description of how the options are handled. So is it discrete, you can only pick one and that's it? Can you hybridize? Can you pick within the range? Whatever it is, that has to be spelled out in a draft document from here on out in order for number 3 to kind of make sense. So it would say, all right, now if there's an appeal, the board has to work within that same sort of latitude that's defined in the original document, is the idea that I think, that's what I was trying to get at. I think John was trying to get there a little bit as well. So, the question is that what the group wants? And, does the wording in either John's document or what I've included here as number 3, does that get to the right amount of flexibility, but not too much flexibility that is provided? So that's the background on this, Spud. There's, all the other edits and things that are included in this document, I think we've talked about before, but it's really that latitude of how much, what's the scope or the range that the Species Management Board has to operate with. So I can give more background, but I know John's interested.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Yeah, and also I think it's important that we understand what that obligates us to in terms of the way Bob described it, in terms of explaining in a document the possibility of taking one from column A, one from column B, and one from column C, and mixing them together to produce some output. And, that could be a challenge with some of our species, to be able to adequately explain, what might happen in a synthesis process of things. So it's just, I don't say, I certainly think that's doable. It just adds to our, our thought process and how do we explain things in a way that the public can understand. So, John, I'll go to you.
Thanks, Bud. And not to belabor it, but, I don't think it's that difficult. And this appeal is the one that just really opened my eyes to the fact that, as I point out in the charter, ISFMP charter, it says, for the hearings, public hearings, these documents will utilize the relevant states' established public review process to elicit public comment on the draft. And as any of us that have to work through our state's Administrative Procedures Acts to change regulations know, it's a very restrictive policy. So what is presented to the public, your latitude is restricted by what you actually present to the public. And we use these hearings, ASMFC hearings, to eliminate having a duplicate hearing when we do a regulation. So, again, I know I'm being overly sensitive here, but it did just open my eyes to the fact that we can just be clearer, I think, in our drafts to point out that, for the addendum 33, I mean, we have a sample size of 1 where an appeal was approved. I looked at the flow chart in there. It would not have given anybody in the public the idea that we could have taken, other than giving Connecticut the bit of quota that we did, then to do other things, it was a very kind of set process. Then you took one of those options based on the way the flow chart was. So, again, it's not a big deal, but I think we can do a pretty easy job of just being clear in our language. And I think it will help just, even when there aren't appeals, just to, if there was any pushback on a addendum or amendment where somebody came back and said, this is not what was presented to the public, we can say, well, we made it clear here that this is the range of options we could have chosen, to address this specific management issue. So I think that's really the main thing, is that if we are clear in the amendment or addendum drafts, that this wouldn't be an issue to start with. Thanks.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you for putting in the time and the thought to think this through and bring this to us. I think we all want this process to be the most transparent and the most effective that it can be. So let's see, Pat, and then I'll go to Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm actually just trying to figure out what the difference between option 2 and 3 is. I mean, they look the same to me.
All right, I'll give it a shot. There's not a whole lot of difference, Pat. You're right. I think option 3 just may elaborate a little bit more. I think within the range is, as it's worded in option 2, that's been, I think some people think of that as really discrete, what I mentioned earlier, 16, 18, 20 size limit, you can pick 17, but it doesn't, within the range, doesn't necessarily allow you to kind of hybridize, a little bit from option A, or, issue 1 and issue 2 and that sort of thing. So it's nuanced, absolutely. But, I think it all comes back down to what John was saying, defining the latitude early in the process so that the public knows what can be kind of mixed and matched. And I think if the draft documents are well written and have up front exactly what can be, what the latitude is for operation for the board, if option 2 or 3 are probably the same because it's within that range that's defined in the document. Yeah.
Functionally.
Yeah.
Go ahead, John, to that.
Yeah, if I could just add to Pat's point there, I mean, once again, our sample size of 1, I would say option 3 would not have allowed us to do what the appeal did, which was to take increase New York's baseline quota while also doing the percentage. However we ended up splitting, the percentage we did to the North region and the South region. That quota to New York was not included in that option as presented to the public. So by my reading, option 3 would not have allowed that to be a specific remedy for the situation we had. So I think it does do that. And of course, next time around, we'll just make sure the draft addendum makes clear what options could be used. So I know I'm getting legalistic here, but, I think it does make a difference. I think there is a difference.
All right, thanks. Anything else, Pat, on that?
I mean, I appreciate John, your description. I don't feel like we went beyond the bounds with the decision that was ultimately made by the policy board. And I think in some cases, it's hard to do a what if here, right, with any of these appeals. But I think the flexibility that would be needed to potentially address something is going to be crucial. So if we are not, if the management, you go back up to the top of the document, if a policy board is not able to resolve the issue, then the management board may need to give that policy board more flexibility to address the problem. So I would hate to handcuff us. I understand what you're trying to do, but sometimes flexibility is a four-letter word, but maybe we need it here.
No, I'm not arguing against flexibility. I'm just saying that when you do something, when you're presenting something to the public and saying, these are our options, these are discrete options, and then you go back and you change something, you can do that, but then the way I see it and the way it would happen in, under our APA, which may be different than other states, is we'd have to go back out to public hearing because we now have a new option that was never presented to the public. And I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm just saying that, make it clear up front. I mean, this is another one of those areas where, because ASMFC is not strictly a governmental body, that if your state is going to use this as a public hearing, as pointed out in the charter that we're allowed to do, I just want to be consistent with the Administrative Procedures Acts in the states. And, this is a very minor problem, and I think it's a problem that we can avoid in the future just by making it clear in the addendum. If even like in draft 33, if it had said clearly in there, we can mix and match the options between these, I think it would have been fine. But, as I said, just some simple fixes could take care of this.
So it sounds like what it comes down to is Delaware's APA, right? So because I'm not sure about the rest of the jurisdictions, but the APA is followed in Maine, for instance, when we go to public hearing. Because I agree about the transparency piece, but it sounds like it's the APA issues in Delaware that may be driving this more than the document or the appeals process.
Yeah, Bob and I talked about that, and I would suspect that there are probably some subtleties in each state's APAs in terms of time you have to give the public to be notified and things like that. But I think the basic concern here is that we could end up doing something that the public didn't clearly understand was an option. And how do we remedy that? Because that in the end should prevent appeals. Presumably, if every jurisdiction knows what could be an outcome of an action, then okay, you can deliberate here at the table, but once it's done, and there's no basis for an appeal anymore. So it's kind of like we have to go back to how do we construct addenda and amendments to ensure that there is clear understanding, and so we don't get ourselves in a situation where a state feels aggrieved, and then you go back to well, option 2 would cover it. As long as that range is fully understood, fully articulated, and everybody knows that we can do within this beginning and this end. So, okay, I think I had Jim and then Dan.
Thanks, Chairman. That was a good, interesting discussion because I had a totally different opinion on that, but I'll leave that one alone for the moment because what I was looking at was option 3 seemed to give the most flexibility, although, and I thought, but John sort of argued that it didn't, but I'll leave that alone. But if we don't choose option 3 is essentially the same language we've been using for summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass, as we come up with a whole series of numbers, and then we go back and we essentially say, as long as it's consistent with when we don't really prescribe the numbers, and then we send them back to the commission and they look at it and they say, yeah, it's within that, whatever. So there was so in that respect, option 3 gives us the most latitude, and it is consistent with pretty much what we're doing for those species. But I think you hit a good point, Spud. There's other species that maybe the public doesn't want latitude, and there's a species coming up this afternoon that I think everybody would want option 1. So especially when it comes to conservation equivalency. So in any event, I like what John did. We'll talk later about what would have been the end result of black sea bass, but essentially it gives us the most latitude, and it's consistent with what we've been doing. So I think that's the way to go, and I don't think we should get into separate appeal things based upon species, because that would really become a nightmare. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Spud. I do like John's compromise language. I was a little baffled when the first debate first began, but talking to John, I definitely see his point. To Pat's point, it sounds like his APA is more restrictive than ours back home. And so if we could kind of embrace that, because I think we all agree that as long as the plan document kind of forecasts or reveals that any combination of these options is an outcome, then I think we're in good shape. As far as which option goes, and we'll get into this, I hope, shortly, but I really like the idea of the policy board being sort of the last group to sort of make the call, because the policy board has a much larger composition of states, and as we know, we talk about allocation and they're very difficult issues, and there was always some talk, mainly by me, about bringing in some impartial folks, and I feel like impartial comes from the policy board, because you might be dealing with an issue that some of the states, say Georgia and Florida, aren't involved with, and then they get to weigh in, and maybe they're the tiebreaker on some of those issues. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. Let's see, I have any. Okay, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I think, maybe at some point there's a little bit of boilerplate language that PDTs can start helping with. But the way I see this in part is kind of what happened with Menhaden, where the board has to take a little more time, kick it back to the PDT one more time. Like, that's where the process is going to be most important. I think, John, I think ultimately that's what you're getting at, is that we get the document right, not rush it out. Everything's in there. And so it may be that we see that every once in a while. We sat at the table and then realize we got to kick it back one more time, but hopefully, get everything done still in a timely manner.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, and as yesterday afternoon revealed, I mean, we're getting into increasingly complicated, management schemes, and it's hard for us to even keep up with it and understand it sometimes. And so I think we've got to do as much as we can to simplify it, and when it is complex, do everything we can to make sure it's adequately communicated to a public that oftentimes is overwhelmed by the complexity of what we're proposing to do. So, all right, so any other comments on this, concerns? This is the time to air them out, because I'd like for us, if everybody's comfortable, to choose the option that they think is best, and we can get this appeals policy revision approved by XCOM and take it forth to the policy board tomorrow. So I'd certainly entertain a motion to approve the changes as have been presented and reviewed over the last several meetings in this meeting, if somebody feels comfortable doing that. All right, Pat?
I would move adoption, or I guess it wouldn't be us adopting it. I would move acceptance of the changes, including option 3, to the document for appeals to be presented to the policy board for final approval.
Thank you, Pat. Do I have a second? John Clark? All right, thank you. All right, any further discussion on the motion? Any opposition to the motion? Seeing none, we'll consider it approved by consent. Thank y'all very much. And we'll bring this to the policy board tomorrow, and I'm sure that will prompt a few more questions, but we'll get them through. So thank y'all. All right, our next agenda item, and I'm sure this one will be real easy, which is discuss use of de minimis and interstate fishery management plans. And I'm going to turn it over to Tony. Go ahead, Bob.
Tony is, I just sent her a text. Yeah, she's on her way from next door, but I've got a filler item if you want me to do that real quick.
Sure.
Just while Tony's wandering over here, for the northern states, or the states involved in American lobster, we had one discussion about how to spend the $14 million and how to distribute the $14 million that's in FY23 budget, or 22 budget. And we had one conference call. National Marine Fisheries Service did some analysis and came out with estimated numbers of active federal lobster permit holders, and gave all those numbers to the individual states. I've talked to most of the states, and they sound like those numbers are pretty good. So I've got a sort of a template for a spend plan. Now, if everyone's okay with those numbers, I'll plug those in, and then we can probably get back together on another call and talk about the details of, how to allocate the money, or review the draft spend plan that Tony and I work on, and talk a little bit about how much is set aside for purchasing trackers and that sort of thing. So if anyone has any concerns over those estimated numbers of active federal permit holders for the lobster fishery, let us know. But I think we're pretty close, which is good. We don't have a whole lot of wrangling to do back and forth between us and NOAA Fisheries. So if everyone's okay with that, we'll update that document, get it out to everyone, and set up another conference call for the administrative folks from the Northeast, if that works.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to clarify, Bob, is it the document that I think Allie Murphy sent around? Are those the current numbers?
Yeah, those are the initial estimates from NOAA, and I guess the idea was if a single pound of lobster was landed in 18, 19, and 20, you qualified as an active permit. So, so if those numbers look reasonable to you, Jay, we can start from there. If you want to, if you don't think they're reasonable, we can figure that out as well.
Nope, I just wanted to make sure I was looking at the right numbers, so thank you for that.
And one of the major, Tony reminded me, one of the major points, or one of the important points, is how do we collectively want to handle some of the administrative burden of the lobster vessel trackers. Maine has suggested they may want to hire a full-time staffer to get their, 1,000 people up and running. And then the question is, some of the smaller states, can they handle it administratively in-house? Probably not. Or should ASMFC hire a staffer for a couple of years while this ramps up? Or could we give Maine a little bit more money, and Maine has a staffer that helps the rest of the states? We got to sort that out. So if you Any suggestions or thoughts on administrative burden and costs associated with this, send it to Tony and I, and we can sort that out, or we can, work it out on the next call that we have. So that's it for my fillers, but if you're all set.
Very good. All right, Tony, we'll turn it over to you.
Am I talking about de minimis first or conservation equivalency? Okay, thank you. All right, in the supplemental materials from the policy board is the de minimis, I'll call it working paper, if you want to follow along. So last summer, around this time, the de minimis work group got together to discuss if there are ways the commission can come together on a de minimis policy. Either is it appropriate to have a de minimis policy that we can do across the board for all of our species boards, or do we need to continue to handle de minimis by individual species boards? And the general sense of the group is I think it is somewhat of a hybrid of those two. And so the work group, we're all in concurrence that, by definition, de minimis states have a negligible effect on a species. And so therefore, those states should not have to constantly be changing their measures to match the FMP as, in particular, species that are trying to rebuild are constantly changing their measures. And that those states that are de minimis should be able to put in a set of management measures and then keep those measures constant. And those measures would have what I would call, some basic level of conservation, as well as try to prevent any loopholes from starting to occur in those states. So the work group was agreed to that, and I think that can start us with a consistent policy across the board for the commission. And then we talked about whether or not there should be consistency on how de minimis gets applied. There is inconsistency in the FMPs on whether or not it's a de minimis application for just the commercial fishery or just the rec fishery, or is it combined? And the work group discussed that in instances where it is combined, some states lose the ability to apply for de minimis in one of their fisheries because of the combination. If a state has a really small commercial fishery but a larger recreational fishery, they don't want to have to constantly be changing commercial measures. And so that combination of the two together prevents a state from being able to apply for de minimis. So, in most instances, it's probably the work group agreed that it's best to have a separation of the two fisheries in order to allow all states to access de minimis as much as possible for their individual fisheries. And then we also talked about de minimis thresholds. So it's the amount of landings that actually determine de minimis. This is somewhat inconsistent across all of the boards. Some FMPs utilize percentages and other FMPs utilize poundage. In some cases, it's 1%. In other cases, it's 3% because there's a combination of the two fisheries together and some that are alone. That 1% and 3% may actually be a little bit different when you break them apart. For example, lobster, it's 40,000 pounds. That is significantly less than 1%. And so the work group discussed whether or not we could have a consistent plan. That's something that the executive committee or the policy board could discuss and say, we're going to make it 1% across the board unless FM species board or FMP determines otherwise. Or we could task each species FMP to go back, look at the de minimis measures, and make a recommendation for what is going to be a negligible impact on the FMP and see what each of the species TCs come back with. That would take some time, obviously, and I don't know if we would get consistency or not. So if the executive committee and policy board are leaning more towards consistency across all plans, then you may want to go with just choosing a percentage and then letting the species FMPs that need to be different do so on their own. And then the work group also discussed sampling requirements, and this is not consistent across all the FMPs. In some cases, sampling requirements are waived for de minimis states, in other cases they're not. The work group didn't come to a conclusion on this because in some cases those outer range species are really important to have sampling for, and so it might be best to think about this on an individual species level to determine what species really do need those outer edge range sampling requirements. They may be less than the rest of the FMP, but we may need to still collect something. So that may or may not be able to apply across the board. And I think that's everything that's in the document.
Thank you, Tony. We've got obviously several members of the group here, so I'd certainly, any of y'all that served on it would like to add to what Tony said. Go ahead, Doug.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think I can add to what Tony said. It was just my appreciation for Tony's recollection. Because we did this almost a year ago, and I asked that this discussion be held to be in person because I think we lost something. I mean, I cracked a couple of jokes that were deadpanned across the phone, and I realized, well, you guys can't see my face. So I just thought it should be an in-person discussion because to me, this is important as conservation equivalency is. You know, if the basis for this is to minimize the burden on those small states that have a fishery but a very small fishery, the way we're doing it right now, allowing different boards to determine whether or not they could even offer it, doesn't get us there. It doesn't relieve my burden as a small state, and I'm sure there's others in the same place. So anyway, I appreciate Tony's recollection of this. I certainly have, I don't know, as you see from this, that we came to a clear consensus is what we want to do, but the options are certainly here. I certainly have my opinion on what I'd like to see, but I just want to thank Tony for tightening this down for us.
Thank you. All right, Roy, we've got you virtually. Can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me, Spud?
Yes, got you loud and clear. Good morning.
Great. Good morning. I would just like to chime in that I support what Tony said with regard specifically, what she said regarding sampling requirements, how they can vary by plan, especially on the outer edge of the range. I think because of the acknowledged climate change effects that we're witnessing and moving northward of species that are more traditionally southern in the range, I think it's important that the sampling requirements, I think the sampling requirements become particularly important because what is today's unimportant species, say in New Jersey or Rhode Island, in New England, could become tomorrow's important species. So I think the sooner that we come to terms with these sampling requirements for species that are vulnerable to climate change, the better off we'll get. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. Go ahead, Dana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm wondering if it would be possible to keep this somewhat variable among plans, but maybe ask any time there's an amendment or an addendum, it was more common, that a combination of the TC and the PDT take a look at it. Because I'm thinking, like Roy, when you have a shifting distribution, it's the TC who's going to say, hey, we could really use samples from in that area and look, the landings are going up there. And maybe the PDT looks at this and says, hey, we're seeing commerce in this species, and maybe that state should really adopt that minimum size because it's becoming kind of an enforcement challenge, especially if one state has commercial rules and the neighboring state doesn't. So, but I'm in favor of allowing the, each plan to have kind of its boutique levels of de minimis.
All right, thank you, Dan. All right, Jay, and then I'll go to Lynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think, just in agreement with both Dan and Roy, I think at a minimum, we need to, if we're basing de minimis on some sort of landing status, we need to be tracking landing. So, a bare minimum of data coming in, I think, is important so that we can make a judgment on de minimis. And then, I kind of like what Tony said. Sorry, I'll finish this thought. But when it comes to scientific sampling, that's where, I think absolving a state of having to invest in something that is not meaningful to their state on the science side, age sampling, whatever it is, which takes time and staff to process, I think that's fine to sort of, free that up. So I think there's like different types of, there's like this residual amount of data you need from everybody so you kind of understand what's going on because things change. But some of the more burdensome aspects, I'm in agreement, I think could be relinquished or freed up or however you want to characterize it. And then, I'm fine with there being nuance in these, but I do like the idea of having sort of like a default. And then if you're not going to do the default, you have to specify why so we can sort of understand why that one's different than the rest. But I like the idea, and it took me a long time to figure out that it wasn't this way. Actually, I thought, 1%. And then, well, not for this one, it's not. And so, I think a default is good. And then if there's a legitimate or important or compelling reason to change it, that can be explicitly defined in the FMP or wherever. It just makes it more clear and easier to track, I think. Thanks.
Thank you, Jay. All right, Lynn.
Yeah, I think Jay sort of summed up what I was going to say. We have a set of constituents in Maryland who really think that de minimis means if you can get yourself declared de minimis, you're exempt from everything. Therefore, let's be de minimis. And it's so I think a clear messaging of what de minimis actually entails is going to be valuable. And with the percentages, the fisheries are so different. I too, for many years, thought that de minimis was set at 1%, and it took me a little time to figure out that not everybody is set at 1%. But I think the default idea is a good one, but the fisheries are so different that I think there is reason to change that. But like Jay said, maybe understanding exactly why that fishery is set differently would help the public understand what we're trying to do with de minimis. For me, it's a little bit of a communications piece because a lot of people are really struggling to understand exactly what it means and why we do it. So if we can help clarify that within our plans, I think that would be helpful.
Thank you, Lynn. Roy, I'm going to go back to you and then Cherie.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. My hand was up by mistake.
Okay, thank you. All right, Cherie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm agreeing with everything I'm hearing. I do like a standard to go, as a default, but also I'm just concerned about variability within fisheries or within species. If we're dealing with a data poor species, we're going to probably want to have a different, this is just an example, just a different sampling regime that might fall outside of a de minimis standard. So I just think it's important to maintain fluidity within de minimis practices. Thanks.
All right, go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, and I think this may be a question if Tony or Bob could help. We have but a handful of species that have sampling requirements. And, I know through the plan review team experience, there's a lot of times where like, they tried in good faith. We're not going to do anything about the fact that they didn't meet that. Weakfish is the classic example. As weakfish started to disappear, states weren't able to meet those sampling requirements. So there's still that flexibility for like a board not to take action if there's, an idea that there's good faith attempts for sampling, right? Okay, I just want to make sure.
Yeah, I think the challenge comes that if there's an expectation, you have to create the capacity to do it, which sometimes can be challenging in, agencies with limited resources of money, time, and people. And so, I think, we're trying to figure out where's some low-hanging fruit here that we can turn this into something actionable. And I think I'm hearing that the development of a standard, whatever it be, 1% or whatever, that you're expected to do, and then a deviation from that would have to be justified, so to speak, through the deliberative processes. But the one I think is also very important but challenging is sort of the first one, and that is the baseline conservation measures that a state would have to implement in order to be adequately protective, but yet not subject to sort of regulatory whiplash issues back and forth. So, I mean, that one is probably the one that's probably most difficult to do because you've got border water issues and that kind of thing. But Doug, I think you had your hand back up.
Well, I was just going to give the classic example of mandatory sampling for us as American eel. We are de minimis in the commercial side and have roughly no recreational except for, bait, a little bit of bait, and yet my limited staff has to go out and sample every spring for American eel, and that's an extreme burden for us, but we make it happen. So obviously I can't make a motion here, but I'm assuming, it sounds like there's some coalition around some ideas and where we're getting that we perhaps want to have every plan have the option of de minimis, which to me is a good thing, and the fact that it is going to be split recreational and commercial but not combined, and that's a good thing. It sounds like there's agreement over maybe a default 1% with some explanation when it's not 1%. I'm good there, and the one thing that we haven't discussed is should there be a running average of landings, which some plans have 1 year, some plans have 2 years, some plans have 3-year averages. And to me, it's a good thing to add the average in there because that, especially for those data limited species, our PSEs are off the chart on a lot of things. So I think we need to add that one in as well. But I like what I hear. That it sounds like over a couple of years we're coming to some agreement.
Okay, thanks, Doug. That's helpful. Chris, Donna?
Yeah, I want to kind of reiterate and support what Doug was saying with the smaller states, particularly a state like South Carolina, where anytime the administrative burden of changing those regulations, we have to go to the legislature. So it's a long, slow process, and being able to separate them is much more advantageous for us, where we have large recreational fisheries and very small commercial fisheries, particularly in some of the finfish species. So I was just thinking what Doug was saying about whether you're talking about those running averages with a lot of the FMPs or in the trigger exercises where, you're comparing to the 1, 2, 3, 4 year averages, you could potentially use that's already built in for your de minimis standard potentially. I don't know. But
Thanks, Chris. Okay, go ahead, Bob.
Just, I guess, a process question as much as anything else. If standards are developed based on, the comments that Doug made in those few different dimensions, what does that mean? Does that mean we go back and modify, or do those standards automatically modify FMPs? Do they trigger or review species by species of the FMP to say, what's in that FMP is different than the standards, and now we need to amend or do an addendum to update that FMP unless the board justify. functionally what happens once we have these standards, I guess is my question. And I'm not, definitely not speaking against them. I'm just trying to figure out where, process-wise, where we go from here.
Sort of what I'm thinking is that we're starting to coalesce around some ideas that can be turned into an options paper for a policy. And then I think the next thing will be to have those presented to us, identify what's missing, if something's missing, and then if we develop a policy, then maybe every time there is an action and a plan, you start bringing that plan into compliance with the new policy. Not have to go back and do this giant redo of all these plans and some of them will probably already be largely compliant, depending on what we pick. But then, it's every time you change, whether it's an addenda or amendment, you now look for consistency with the new policy, if that's a reasonable approach. Jay?
Yeah, I had the same exact thought, Mr. Chair. That seems like kind of a good process because, I think as we were talking, oh God, do we do a big giant omnibus like every FMP? Let's go for it and knock it all out. But it seems like a little more efficient. I don't think any of this is creating like massive difficulties for anyone at this particular time. So creating the big sort of omnibus default is like one piece. And then as actions come up, just sort of pulling the de minimis. And maybe we can even look at the de minimis sections in the FMPs and make sure each of them has the percentage of landings plus the average. That was a good one, Doug. I think that's important. And then another section that says default measures for de minimis. Have them all clearly in that section. And then, and so we just pick away at it as we go. I like that approach.
Tony?
Most of the plans will have those pieces to it. However, the policy gets crafted would alter many of those plans. What is not in many of the plans is default measures, and so that would take some time to pull together. And then the other can of worms, which I will open, is the jointly managed species. Generally speaking, NOAA Fisheries does not recognize de minimis, so it becomes tricky. And I think the complementary species might be a little bit easier to deal with. I haven't fully processed that yet, but I know that the jointly managed species will be difficult, just as to put it on your radar. We will try to work through it, and I'll try to have some conversations with NOAA and the council and figure out how we can address it in this options paper that we draft. But I just wanted to get that on everybody's radar.
So do you think you have enough to sort of frame up an options paper and then vet that through the work group? If the work group members are still willing to be involved, and use them as a sounding board on it, and then, once the work group's comfortable with its content, then we can further deliberate on it at this level and hopefully move it to across the finish line at some point in the near, not too distant future. So are you comfortable with
Yes,
that?
and I'll try to identify those species where I think the 1% might not be a viable option as well. Like off the top of my head, I'm not sure menhaden and lobster where 1% would work, because it would be like Maine and Virginia would be the only states that weren't de minimis almost. So a couple of these species we'll have to, we'll think about.
Okay, any last words on the de minimis topic? Everybody comfortable with where we're at on that one? Okay, I think we've got a plan, so good. We didn't have conservation equivalency on there, but if you want to talk about it, I think we've got time. Okay.
Just really quick where we are in conservation equivalency, just to keep you all updated. The MSC had their 8 questions task from the executive committee. They actually farmed those questions to a smaller subset of the MSC. That subgroup is working through those 8 questions. We need to write up answer, a real draft of answers to those questions, and then make alterations to the conservation equivalency guidance document, and then bring that back to the Management and Science Committee for their review. Once they take a look at it, we'll bring it back to the Executive Committee, and our hope to do that is at the August meeting. And I will shoot for this policy paper for the August meeting as well.
All right, thanks. Any questions about that for Tony? Go ahead, Jay.
You almost got through.
I had to bait you up on that one, didn't I?
So I'm on that the working group from this body. Tony, a question from me is, like, that sort of interestingly bureaucratic process notwithstanding, is there an opportunity for, like, a tangent? So I think, and it came up because I think I brought it up probably numerous times, but this idea of trying to use the risk and uncertainty tool, is that something we can also work on, like, tangentially to the question piece?
It's funny you asked that, Jay. I was going to talk to you about that yesterday, and well, just ran out of time. I think it is something that you and I and Sarah can think about. You know, the risk and uncertainty tool, we were potentially going to talk about it at policy board this meeting, but we sort of ran out of time, and we are also sort of at a loss of species that we would test it on again, if that is the will of the policy board. The first species that really comes to Sarah and my mind is cobia, and that wouldn't be till 2025. We have some things to chat with you about on how it could or couldn't work, and how much alterations we would need to do to address CE for the tool, and how fast those changes might or might not need to work. So, but definitely an opportunity.
Okay. All right. Tell you what, why don't we leap over to other business, and then we'll have to go into closed session after that. So, Jim?
Thanks, Chairman. And this is just an update on, I think most of you are aware of a letter that I've been circulating. And first, thanks for everybody who's been, very cooperative. Just a little background on it. So, and this was in response to, there's a rulemaking out right now for significant cuts in black sea bass and scup on, stocks that are extreme. The biomass is very high, but because of some triggers under Magnuson, we're actually doing major cuts to the recreational fishery. So, and we've gone through discussion on it, and then about a week or so ago, Mike Pentney sent out a letter saying that, yep, we're doing these cuts, and in fact, with scup, it's actually even worse, because based upon their assessment, the cuts are even going to be higher, and we're going to have potential EEZ closures and so on and so forth. So, but in that letter, he did, what I saw was maybe a bit of an opener, because he did have quoted absent secretarial action. They were going with these things. So my commissioner, when I talked to him about it, he said, well, he'd write a letter to the secretary. And I said, well, I think that would be great, but I thought it would be more powerful if multiple states did it. So we sent it out to most of the states, and the draft is around. I sent it out last night. Other than one tweak to it, I'll send out the updated version this morning. And, if we can get that, the idea is to get that out by Friday. Originally, we thought we had to get it out yesterday, but Tony had talked to some people at the service, and they said it's not really like a comment letter on the rulemaking. It's more about the fishery itself and the management. So if we get that out by Friday, I think we're in good shape. And that gives some states a couple extra days. I know, some states can sign the stuff and get their commissioner to sign in 2 seconds. Other states have to go through a lot of hoops. So again, it gives a couple more days of, if you can get through the highest person in your state to sign it up to your commissioner or secretary, whatever the appropriate one is, that'd be great. And I put in the note, I think I'll probably need some help somewhere to getting electronic signatures and things like that, but we'll try to get that out by Friday. And if you have other comments to the letter, I think we incorporated most of them, would be great. The only last note is, I think after we put this one around, Tony was talking to John Maniscalco on my staff and some other folks, I think Joe Semino, J Mac, whatever. So there's actually a second letter. But that letter was more, I guess, designed to focus in primarily on the SCUP issue. And that letter was designed to go to Janet Coit. And it was really getting into the impacts to the industry and the fishing community about the SCUP fishery. So, and that one's ready to go. That one would only be signed by state directors, though. So us around the table, I think it would be a little easier to get that out. So I will send that out today also. And if you could look at that same time frame, if we could get that out by Friday, and we'll do that by email. So again, I think. I'm not sure how well it's going to work, but I don't think it's going to hurt either of the letters, and I think it will clearly send to the both the secretary and the assistant administrator that, you know, the states are pretty well in agreement on this, which doesn't happen around this table on some species, and well, who knows what will happen, but at least we'll give it a shot. And I thank everybody for their indulgence and the crazy timing of this, because I got a thing last night from my commissioner, well, not my commissioner, the executive chamber, that I sent them to this over a week ago, and they sent yesterday, why does it have to go out today, and why are we just seeing it? I said, well, you got to read your email, is part of the problem, but in any event, we understand our executives and how they work, but again, thanks for all the effort on that, and we'll see what happens. So any questions, I'd be glad to take. Thanks.
Okay, any questions for Jim on that? Good luck. I mean, I wish you the best. We don't have a dog in this fight, but we're behind you 100% because we've been exactly in your place before.
Well, I do have a package for you, Scott.
A few years ago when the EEZ was closed and we didn't get to have that fishery that year. Yeah, we know all about it.
Well, we do have, I sent a Federal Express package of some SCOBY, from some scup and black sea bass to both you and South Carolina, because I remember Robert Boyle said at one point, I wouldn't know a scup if it hit me in the head, so, but figured maybe we could get you guys to join it. Thanks.
All right, thanks. We've got a few extra minutes. Anything else that's come up? John?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. This is just, some of you may already know about this program. I know, talking to several of you, that everybody's having problems filling positions, and Department of Defense has a program called the Skill Bridge Internship Program, which some of you may be aware of, and it takes service people that are within 6 months of their retirement from the service. Department of Defense continues to pay them, and they work for you as an intern. We had one last year, an airman from Dover Air Force Base, and it was fantastic because, as many of you have probably seen too, not to be railing about the young people, but you get a lot of people that don't know anything about outboard motors, boat maintenance, things like that. This guy had worked on C5s and C17s, so he had it down. You know, there was no problems there, and we are going to be getting another one this year. It's a fantastic program, and as everybody is shorthanded, just something, if you weren't aware of it already, to be aware of. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, John. That's a common sense approach to a problem, isn't it? Kind of appreciate that every once in a while. You know, you get to see those every once in a while. All right, Lynn.
Yeah, thanks. I was just going to ask, John, would you mind sending out an email? Could you do that, or send it with the name of the program?
Sure. Yeah, it's called Skill Bridge, but yeah, I'll get the information from DOD.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Very good. Anything else that's popped up in folks' minds since they've been sitting here? All right, not seeing any, then we're going to go into closed session.